So everybody can hear me okay, I hope.
Yep.
And I will just go ahead and put up my first slide. Oh, that's not my first slide. That's my first slide. There we go. Okay, great. So thank you all for joining us, for being here today. So I'm going to talk about heritage barns, partly at Ebey's Landing, partly kind of statewide. And I'll give you a little bit of an overview of kind of what I'm going to cover, a little bit about the state program, kind of what's going on in Olympia that has benefited Ebey's and hopefully will in the future. A little bit about the barn types at Ebey's, kind of by chronology, but also other ways of analyzing and looking at barns. And then trying to distill some of that information into what could be a short tour for visitors to see, and then kind of finish with some thoughts about sharing, how you can share some of this information with visitors. So, and I'll just note that each of the slides is numbered down at the bottom. So if you have a question and you want me to go back to a particular slide, just make a note of that number down on the bottom right corner. And I'll try to save plenty of time at the end for questions. So I'll start with a little bit more about my work as a preservation consultant. I often work in rural communities. I actually live on Vashon Island. I don't know if I mentioned that, but so I'm coming to you from my island to yours. And I have had my own consulting business for almost 20 years now. And I worked for the King County Historic Preservation Program before that. So I often work in rural communities, doing research on research and documentations of historic buildings and landscapes, everything from barns and grange halls to Native American sites and heritage boats. But then I also end up doing a lot of projects on the Duwamish River in Seattle and South King County, and urban ethnic history. So I'm kind of all over the place in my work, but the through line is generally a focus on cultural significance. And I'll just say, I discovered Ebey's Prairie in 1993. I was in college in Seattle, and that summer I lived in Port Townsend. And I would take a ferry over and just explore Ebey's and fell in love with the place. And I also discovered Toby's Tavern that summer, so it was a very good summer. But so that said, you all know Whidbey and you all know Ebey's better than I do. So let me know if I don't quite get something right. But I'm hoping that this presentation may be able to offer you kind of some insights into familiar and beloved landscapes. So I'll start with some background on the State Heritage Barn Program, because it gives a little bit of context kind of statewide for the interest in preserving heritage barns. So the program was approved by the state legislature in 2007. And I'm happy to report that barn preservation is a bipartisan issue. The Heritage Barn Bill was unanimously approved in the State House, and all but 2 state senators voted for it. So that barn bill did 2 things. It established the State Heritage Barn Register, and it also created a barn grant program. And this image is on the cover of a report from the State Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation, or DAHP, that sort of chronicles the program so far. And the program did not end in 2019. It just, that was when the grant program responsibility was transferred from DAHP to the Washington Trust for Historic Preservation. So the state kind of put together this compendium of the program so far, and that is available online. So according to the state, a heritage barn is any large agricultural outbuilding. So it does not have, a heritage barn doesn't actually have to be a barn. It can be a granary, it can be some other kind of interesting, there's a prune dryer, there's a hop kiln, can be any large agricultural building used to house animals, crops, or farm equipment that is over 50 years old and has been determined eligible to be listed in the Washington Heritage Register or in the National Register of Historic Places, or has been listed in a local register and approved by the State Advisory Council for Historic Preservation. So owners nominate their own barns to the register, and the owners provide the documentation. And a big motivation is to become eligible to apply for the barn preservation grants. The program has awarded over 100 grants so far, totaling over $2 million. So these are just some samples from around the state of some of the properties that have received grants. The criteria for awarding the grants are the historical significance of the barn, the urgency of the project, so the need for the repair, and the preservation of the barn's historic character, but also things like visibility of the barn from a public roadway. So that visibility was considered an important aspect of the public benefit of the grants and part of the justification for public investment. And the grant reviewers also give special consideration to barns that are still in agricultural use. So when we look at Ebey's, the Ebey's Landing National Historical Reserve has 23 barns listed in the Heritage Barn Register. And of course, there are some other barns, additional barns on the reserve that are not listed. But these are the ones on the slide whose owners have nominated their barns to the Heritage Barn Register. And the map is a little funky. It actually comes out of the state DHP database. And there are a couple of things off, like one of the Pratt sheep barns is in the wrong place, but it kind of gives you an idea. So I'm going to really focus in on this central area today, on the Ebey's Prairie and Crockett Prairie. And I'll make one comment about the names of the properties. So the nomination form for the barn register lists both the historic name, which is usually the people who built the barn, and then the common name or the current name of the farm. But the database map only provides the historic names, which are in bold on the map. And I've added in some of the current names or the more familiar names in parentheses. So that's why you see pairs of names for a lot of these properties. So I'm going to talk about barns on the reserve in a few different ways. Mainly I'll focus on the chronological sequence based on construction dates, but we'll also kind of look at the cluster of attributes that define eras of barn construction. So that includes changes in the framing or structural systems, in the shift from the timber frame to lighter balloon frame or plank frame. It also reflects the initial use or purpose of a barn. So a dairy barn versus a sheep barn versus a horse barn. And the plan or shape is influenced by all of these things, but it also indicates how changes in farming technology have led to changes in barn construction. But first we'll talk about roof form. So this is the easiest way to categorize barns, by the shape of the roof. And this is how our state preservation office has decided to identify barns. And in some ways, roof shape or roof form is a useful indicator of other things, like construction era and framing system. But in other ways, it's no more useful than categorizing people by hair color. Like, it tells you some things, but it doesn't really tell you that much, but it's easy to see from a distance, right? So, and every barn typology is different. I'll just show this a little bit bigger so you can see it a little better. I like this one. It was actually done by an artist in Tacoma because it's fun to look at. And you'll see some other names around the country, depending on where you're from. You might call a gable barn might be called an English barn, especially if it has the alley door in the long side rather than the short side. A broken gable might be called a Western barn. A monitor roof down on the bottom might also be called a Western barn. Sometimes those are called basilican barns. The gambrel roof sometimes are identified as prairie barns or Wisconsin barns in the middle of the country. The difference you see here on the Dutch gambrel, the eaves flare out, and on an English gambrel or sort of regular gambrel, the eaves are straight. But what defines any gambrel roof is the two pitches. So wider at the top and then steep on the sides, which creates almost like a box for your haymow. So it gives you a lot more space up top for that hayloft. So a salt box barn, which is down at the bottom, is something called that's truly a salt box barn, is usually built in that, built that way. But you also see these called a gambrel or a gable barn with a lean-to, if the central, the center part was built first and then the lean-to was added on later. So the multiple names for each of the farms, multiple names for each of the barn types. But this kind of gives you a sense of the categories that we're going to start with. And now we'll shift to the kind of chronology of the reserve. So just a little bit of an overview. These three time periods I'd say they're a little bit arbitrary in the sense that there really is a long transition between each of these phases. And there are exceptions to all of these generalizations. But the time periods are useful in looking at clusters of characteristics. So we'll look at each of these areas in more depth in the next few slides. But I would say that the most salient characteristic of the 19th century barns are those heavy timber frames. And from the middle period, from the early 20th century, the gambrel roof form would probably be the standout characteristic. And then the barns built since the Depression, since the 30s, are shaped really by farming specialization and by mechanization. So for the 19th century barns, and we're really talking about barns built between 1860 and 1900, they usually have gable roofs and heavy timber frames, but are usually relatively small. So in that era, hay was stored loose. It was before baling machines were widely available. And the loose hay was either stored in the loft or on hay platforms on the main floor. And barns from this area usually have vertical boards rather than horizontal, with some amount of space in between each board to ensure good ventilation, good circulation, because barns from this area rarely had cupolas or ventilators, at least to begin with. So the ventilation was primarily from the gaps between the vertical board siding. So the Boyer barn, also known as the Hugh Crockett barn, from the 1860s, and the Keith barn, or the Rosehip barn, from 1898, up top, are pretty typical examples. And I have to say, the Boyer barn, the Hugh Crockett barn, really demonstrates why the State Heritage Barn Register is so valuable. Because the historic farmhouse that was on the Boyer farm was destroyed. So it's no longer, it isn't considered an intact farmstead. So it would not be regarded as eligible for the National Register. So there's still a strong focus, and I would actually say kind of a strong bias in favor of homes in preservation documentation. So, and you even see this in the reserve inventory, the farmhouses are really the focus of documentation. So the barns are included as outbuildings, sometimes with photos, sometimes not in the inventory. But the Heritage Barn Register gives an opportunity to really document and appreciate the barns in their own right, whether or not they're still associated with the original farmhouse. So there are also some smaller barns in town or close to town. Like you see the Calhoun barn down in the bottom right. And some of these, especially the ones in town, are kind of, you could basically consider them like one horse garages, right? So or subsistence barns, maybe house the family cow or a pig, some chickens. But most often the barns in town, like the barn behind the Lovejoy Inn or the Watson House and the Tesoro barn, were probably for a horse that would have pulled a carriage or buggy. So I just love this photo from the Ebey's Forever blog. As I said, the most notable characteristic of barns from this area are these heavy timber frames. So these are hand-hewn post and beam, mortise and tenon joinery, sometimes also called peg and dowel. Although they're not exactly the same thing, those terms are sometimes used interchangeably. This is the interior of the Boyer barn. These are 10-inch square posts and beams. That construction is just so impressive. And just to finish out kind of this early era, I would include the main barn at the Lesord or Ebey Road Farm from 1898, and the Kenneth Farm barn out on Route 20. This is sometimes described as a Dutch barn. It was built in 1903. It's a different form, but still has that timber frame. And also the oldest portion of the Engel Farm barn dates to this period. So what have I not talked about so far from the 19th century barns? Probably the two most famous barns in the area, the Walter Crockett barn, built in 1895, and the Willowwood or the Smith Farm barn, built in 1880, and so sadly lost in the fire in 2017. And I'm going to come back to talk about these two barns toward the end of the presentation. So moving into the 20th century, you start to see these gambrel roof barns, and this indicates a significant change in barn construction. That lighter framing with dimensional lumber, so you have more sawmills available locally everywhere, and that dimensional lumber gives you an opportunity to open up a significantly larger space for hay storage in the hay mow. So you see this described as plank framing or balloon construction, especially if it's a house, but with barns, it's usually called plank framing or braced rafter construction. And depending on exactly how it's built, it can be there are several different kind of approaches to this kind of plank framing, but it's quite distinct from timber framing. This type of barn was often associated with dairying, and with the influence of scientific principles in farming. So especially after 1914, when the Cooperative Extension Service was created in association with the land-grant universities, you really start to see the gambrel roof barns proliferate. And the Jenny Farm barn is a great example. This is from 1908. This barn was originally constructed, so it's a really good example of this, this type in this time period. And other barns from this time period include the Smith Prairie barn out at the game farm. That was built in 1910. And the Gallagher Schreck, or the Al Sherman barn from 1917, and both of the Rubel barns on Fort Casey Road. Those are built around 1930. And this is not a barn on Whidbey Island. This is actually an illustration from the 1919 Sears barn catalog. So you've heard of Sears kit houses, where you could order, go through your Sears catalog and order a kit house. Well, you could order yourself up a barn kit with all the dimensional lumber that would be typically shipped by rail to most of the country. And then you get a local builder to build it for you. And there were a lot of barn catalogs starting in kind of the late 19th century, early 20th century, where you could either order plans or you could actually order the kit of lumber, both from national publishers, and even local lumber mills had barn kits, like Boise Cascade and Potlatch Lumber would have these barn packets, barn kits that you could get. So Whidbey Island seems to have had some really skilled local builders, so who may or may not have availed themselves of these kind of plans. But the designs influenced farmers' ideas about what kind of barns they wanted, because these designs were seen just in all kinds of farming journals and in all kinds of government agency reports. So this example on the slide was one of several techniques for framing these gambrel roof barns that were developed in the early 20th century. And the goal of all of them was to provide like sufficient structural support to enclose the maximum amount of unobstructed space for hay storage. So looking around the landscape, just to kind of wrap up the discussion of early 20th century barns with these two examples from the mid 1930s, because they demonstrate how long the transitions were from between when like a new barn form was introduced and when that form was widely adopted. So that's the Comstock barn, or the Boyer barn, up at Engle Road and Hill Road on the left, and the Clark Sherman barn by the cemetery on the right. Those images are from the Heritage Barn Register nomination, and you can see a bit of the interior of the Sherman barn. Looks a lot like that previous drawing in the previous slide. So when I looked at both of these barns, I would have guessed that they had been built earlier. I would have guessed it probably about 1910 on the Comstock barn and 1920 on the Sherman barn. And these two barns also illustrate how varied agriculture has been at Ebey's and how much it has evolved on individual farms. So the Comstock barn was built originally for sheep, including storage of alfalfa, and then dried peas and oats and vetch for hay and wheat later. And then later still, it was converted to use as a squash storage barn. And on the Sherman barn, the Clark Sherman barn, one telling detail I found in the Heritage Barn Register documentation was that this Sherman barn, built in 1935, replaced an older barn that had burned down that year. So may very well have been just literally rebuilding the barn that had burned down. I don't know that, but it seems like a real possibility. And the wings were added later in the 1940s. So this barn, this Clark Sherman barn, was used for milking a herd of Guernseys in the 1930s and 40s. Then they raised turkeys. When they raised turkeys in the 1950s, the barn was used to store stacked feed, and then shifted back to storage of hay and straw in the loft when the family shifted back to dairying. The ground floor was used for storage of farm machinery, seed, fertilizer, seed boxes, and pigs. So a very adaptable space. So now we're up to kind of the more recently constructed barns, especially since the 1930s. Here we see two favorites, one of the Pratt sheep barns from the early 1930s and the Sherman Hog House from 1942. These are both good examples of specialized structures, purpose-built for a specific kind of farming. I'm actually going to set those aside for a moment and talk kind of more generally about adaptations in the decades since the Great Depression. So the Aloha or Hancock Farm barn on the top right is a good example. This is the one on Engle Road, just next to the Jenny Farm. This barn was built in 1953 to replace an older barn. And when I look at this barn, I envision tractors and baled hay. Both of those things had a big impact on farming and on barns, but the changes happened over many years, right? So there were early adopters and there were folks who took their time in changing the way they did things. So like for a parallel today, you might think about electric cars. So the first electric cars were actually invented in the 19th century and then kind of reinvented in the 1970s, and then finally became more broadly available in the 2000s. But there's still sort of a new thing, right? So and there's still lots of old cars on the road. So when someone looks back in 100 years to say like, well, when did the electric car change everything? They're probably going to look at like the Prius and the Tesla as game changers, but the game takes a really long time to change, right? So even though you could say the hay baler and the tractor revolutionized farming, it was a really slow revolution, and it shows up even more slowly in how buildings change to respond to it. But it meant that farmers no longer needed those giant hay mows to store hay. And they could put hay bales in a lot of places. They could put, so they didn't need, the barns didn't need to be that tall. It also meant that parking for equipment probably became more important than parking for horses. So you didn't need that much hay anyway, unless you were dairying or raising livestock. So I'm going to come back to the Pratt barns and the hog barn in a minute, but I'll mention a couple of other heritage barns from this era that are up actually on the north side of Penn Cove. One is the Early Wine or the Eckholm Farm, also known as the Nienhaus Place up on Zylstra Road, and the Rip or Adamson Farm that is up on Monroe Landing Road. Those also date from this time period. So now that I've sort of thrown all this information at you, what do you do with it? How do you, what's a good way to share this with visitors? So I think you can actually convey a lot about the history of barns and farming at Ebey's by talking about just a few barns. And I chose these barns partly because they each tell an interesting story about their era, and partly because they are distinct forms. They're very distinct from each other, and partly because they're all visible from the road. So, it's possible to pull over and look at them, maybe even take a photo fairly safely and without trespassing. So the Crockett Barn, this is such an icon of the reserve, right? Built in 1895. And this one, it defies everything I said earlier about the typical 19th century barns. It is not small. It does not have a gable roof. It has this hipped roof that may be unique in the state. It doesn't have vertical siding, but what it does have in common with other 19th century barns is a massive timber frame. So this image shows the lower floor, and look at the size of those posts and beams. It's just amazing construction. So according to the Heritage Barn Register form, it was built by the Lovejoy brothers, who built so many distinguished buildings in central Whidbey. And the photo itself is worth mentioning. It's part of the collection of photos and measure drawings created by Ann Kidd, I think in 2007. Excuse me, the photos are all black and white. They're done, they're large format done with a large format camera. specific to National Park Service standards for the Historic American Building Survey, or HABS. So this was done as part of her master's thesis, and she documented 11 barns and farmsteads at Ebey's, and the photos are available on the Library of Congress website. And this is another one of her photos. And aside from the size of the Crockett barn, another one of the unusual aspects of it that you probably know from your own experience, you can sort of see in this slide, is the barn is accessible both from ground level and it's accessible at ground level from both the upper and lower floors. So these are often called Pennsylvania bank barns, and they're much more common in the eastern US, pretty rare in the western US. And it's worth noting the role that the Crockett barn and farm has had in the area's social history. Its present use as for private and community events apparently builds on a long history that goes back to Colonel Crockett welcoming soldiers stationed at Fort Casey and local families for Sunday gatherings. So it's not just farming and architecture, right? This is also about the social history of the area. And I just wanted to point out that the Crockett Granary is visible on the right side of this photo, and I'll come back to granaries in just a minute. So if we head up Fort Casey Road, we come to the Rubel Barn. Actually, one of two Rubel barns owned by father and son on opposite sides of the road. This larger one is the one now owned by National Park Service. And it's right next to the road, so very visible. And it's an interesting example of those early 20th century gambrel roof barns with the huge hay mows. The first section was built in the 1930s, and it has evolved over time. I thought this was really cool. This is from the Historic Structures report that the National Park Service prepared for the barn. And it shows the initial modest-sized barn up top. The report actually lists 1937 as the construction date in one place and 1935 in another place. And I've also seen it listed as 1930. So sometime in the 1930s, the initial piece was built. And then an expansion in 1948 on the north end doubled the size of the barn, which meant they could double the size of the dairy herd to deal with changes in milk processing. That was about the period of time that the creameries and milk processors shifted from filling milk cans to requiring farmers to fill bulk tanks in order to kind of stay on the pickup route. So the dairy herd expanded in order to be able to do that. And then another expansion in 1955 added the single-story spaces at the south end, and also made improvements to ventilation and other health and safety issues for the barn, and made structural upgrades. So, and the whole farmstead is really interesting. This whole place is just, an exhibit in the history of farming. And here's what that hay mow looks like more recently, with that braced rafter construction or plank framing. So they could get enough hay in here to feed a herd of more than 60 cows for the winter. And so now we'll kind of wander around the loop to look at the Pratt sheep barns. And I would say this counts as being visible from the road, right? It's sort of off in the distance. I was talking with Sarah Steen the other day. She's now working at the preservation office where I used to work in King County. And we were talking about how Ebey's is such a sort of mystical landscape. And I think part of that is these barns and other buildings that just have this kind of quiet presence in the landscape that is so beautiful. So the Pratt barns, there's Sarah getting ready for the 2017 field school. At the NPS Pratt barn on the right, and then the one on the left is the one out toward the bluff, the Nature Conservancy Pratt barn. These barns have got a lot of love over the years to keep them going. And although they're not quite twins, but they both have yet another kind of framing system, which is referred to as pole barns. So it's sort of like mini timber frames. You can see that drawing in the upper left that shows kind of the roof support system, and then the kind of aerial version looking down on the right. This type of construction came in kind of the mid-20th century using both round logs and dimensional lumber. But they have these kind of interior support posts that look like the old timber framing. So it's almost a reinvention of that approach. And since these barns were built specifically for sheep, you see features in the landscape like water troughs, grain bins, sheep dips. They had room for hay storage in the center of the barn, and then sheltered space for lambing in the wings. And the rehabilitation process for both was quite remarkable. These are, this is part of the documentation for the NPS barn at the beginning of the work to turn it into an outdoor classroom. And finally, the hog palace, the Sherman Hog Barn, in all 200 feet of its glory. So my favorite bit of history about this barn that I came across, according to the Heritage Barn Register, it was built in 1942 with wood from the old barracks at Fort Casey. And that was also the wood that was used to build the Comstock barn up the road. So this barn has been used initially for hogs. It's also been used for sheep, for turkeys, for storing Hubbard squash, for hay and for cattle. So this one has had quite a career, even though it's relatively young by reserve standards. So I think just in highlighting these 4 buildings, the Crockett Barn, the Rubel Barn, the Pratt Barns, and the Sherman Hog Barn, you can share a lot of information about barns and farming with visitors without, getting into a ton of detail and without sending them a bunch of different places. So I want to shift to just quickly touch on granaries, because they're such an extraordinary part of the reserve's landscape, and they tend to get kind of overshadowed by barns. I would say I have never seen such a varied collection of granaries anywhere in the state. The only other place I've really seen a collection of granaries is in Stevens County in Northeast Washington, but those tend to be smaller and older. And your granaries are just marvelous. Here are just a few of them. So I wanted to talk about kind of how some things that make granaries different from barns. For one thing, they're built to keep animals out rather than to keep animals in. So specifically to keep rodents out. So they are often built elevated off the ground a bit. They're generally built to be airtight to preserve grain and keep it dry. If you remember what I said about the 19th century barns, how the vertical boards were spaced apart to keep that all important air circulation going. So the hay did not spontaneously catch fire. And why it was such a big deal when cupolas were added to the barn roofs to increase ventilation. Granaries were not generally for storing hay, but they were for storing wheat, oats, barley. Some became squash barns and served other purposes, but granaries tend to be smaller than barns. They tend to be really stoutly built to bear the weight of the sacked grain or bins of grain. And they played an important role in preserving crops to get farmers through the winter. And this view of the Clark Sherman granary, that photo, I actually took that photo from the cemetery. So a lot of the granaries are kind of hard to pick out in the farmsteads that have a lot of outbuildings, but that one, there's a wonderful view of it from the cemetery. So I also wanted to touch on, just kind of to acknowledge the phenomenal effort and funding that has gone into so many different barn rehabilitation projects over the years. So I was tremendously impressed as I started out doing research to prepare for this presentation at the field schools and the Heritage Barn grants and the Ebey's Forever grants and the agency funding and the donations and all of the volunteer work that's gone into stabilizing and restoring so many of these buildings. And I bet many of you have contributed to those efforts over the years. And it's just had an amazing impact on extending the life of these buildings. And I said at the beginning of my talk that there were 23 barns on the reserve that were listed in the state Heritage Barn Register. Really, there are 22 barns and one very beloved ghost of a barn. So the Willowwood Barn, or the Smith Ranch Barn, was one of the oldest. It was one of the largest, and certainly one of the most photographed of the barns on the reserve. And what a hard loss that was to lose that one to fire. It has been documented in various ways over the years, but we all know that documentation is not a substitute for the real thing. So I did see some discussion early on after the fire about the possibility of rebuilding the barn, and I'm curious where that stands. If there's if you all might know kind of more about what's going on with that. today. But just wanted to acknowledge that Willowwood is still listed in the Heritage Barn Register, even though it's gone. So just some final thoughts on some sources of information that are available to you. And I can pass some of this on to Jordan, some links to websites and just some things you might want to explore further. So everything that I use to prepare for my talk today is drawn from publicly available information. The State Heritage Barn Register nominations are all public information. They can be a little tricky to find on the state's website, but it is possible to find them. And they vary in quality, but for example, the nomination for the Rubel Barn, owned by the Park Service, includes a great overview on the local dairying industry that was drawn from that historic structures report that I mentioned earlier. And of course, the reserve inventory is available online. All of the HABS documentation, the Historic American Building Survey, photos and drawings and reports are available on the Library of Congress website. And one that I haven't mentioned yet is the Washington Trust for Historic Preservation's Revisiting Washington website includes a tour of Ebey's Landing that mentions several heritage barns. So there's a lot of information out there and a lot of possibilities to create exhibits or create guides or all kinds of ways to share information with your visitors about barns. So that is what I have prepared, and I would love to devote the rest of our time to kind of questions and discussion and your thoughts on interpreting barns for your visitors. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Holly. If I can have you, let's see, stop sharing your screen just so that way we can see everyone.
Right.
And see who has questions here. Wow, I took so many notes from that. I found that so interesting. Thank you for really breaking that down and helping at least me and I'm sure others figure out how we refer to these different barns and time frame, and there's a lot in there for sure. Who has questions for Holly? We all might need a minute to process it all. I had a couple questions. On slide 17, you talked about the barn kits. And so I was just curious as to what, did you see anywhere like a price for those barn kits at that time?
Oh yeah, that example I showed from the Sears barn catalog, every page has a price on it. Gosh, I don't have it in front of me, but it very deliberately ranges from the modest, very small, very simple barns with kind of minimal equipment in the hundreds of dollars to the really elaborate, tricked out dairy barns, enormous for thousands of dollars.
On slide 18, you referred to a couple barns and you said that you thought they would have been built much earlier. Why did you think that? And maybe I missed it, but just finishing sort of that thought there.
Yeah, so just looking at, it was the Comstock barn and the Clark Sherman barn. And just when I'm looking through documentation of barns, I often just try to look at the building first and see, just kind of what I notice about, kind of look at the roof form to see what that might tell you about the framing system. Look at, just look at the shape, look at what you can tell about the construction. And I try to kind of guess a date in my head before I look at whatever the research says it is. And those were two where just in looking at them, I would have guessed that they were much earlier, not much earlier, but a decade or two earlier, just based on, based on their appearance, based on what I could interpret about the construction techniques. So it was just kind of interesting. I mean, I think my point about the electric cars, there's this sense of kind of an artificially fast sense of transition when people talk about the impact of a new invention as if it happens overnight, like you flip a light switch and suddenly all the barns look different. And I guess my point is that transition happens over 10, 20, 30, 40 years. So there might be this really important introduction of kind of new ways that scientific approaches might guide, sanitation, or new construction techniques of using milled lumber. But you don't see that, the implementation of that widespread for, a generation or two. So yeah, it's just those transitions are much longer processes than we might think.
Well, I have a question. The barn you referred to as the Nature Conservancy sheep barn out toward the bluff. My understanding is Nature Conservancy really doesn't want to handle construction or buildings. Are they maintaining that? I know a lot of work was done on it, a few years ago, fairly recently. And so are they maintaining or taking care of that barn? And maybe I missed the original owners of that barn. That was also a Pratt barn?
It was also a Pratt barn. And I don't know about, I know there's been some kind of complicated discussions over the years about management, both of buildings and landscapes. And I don't know the answer to your question about their willingness to take care of it. They did nominate it to the Heritage Barn Register. So they have that recognition. They have the possibility of applying for state barn grants. But I think as you said, they've done a lot of work. There has been a lot of work done on the barn, and now it's really an issue of stewardship, and just ensuring that it's taken care of. And I don't know what the kind of status or the intent of that is.
Thank you.
I'm curious if anyone knows if there's still discussion about the possibility of reconstructing the Smith barn, or if that is not really a current conversation. Does anybody know kind of what is going on with that?
And I don't know if Jason's on there as well, if he has any thoughts with that.
Yeah, I can comment real quick. The Smith family has moved forward with the construction of a small, what property owner refers to as a workshop on the site of the old barn. It's much, much smaller in stature. You can see it from, the overlook or from Ebey Road. There's two small buildings side by side there. And that, went through our office because it is on an MPS easement. And we did verify that it is their intention at the moment to use that small building as the replacement structure for the barn, since there's only one structure allowed on that site. So that's what I know.
Okay. Well, it's interesting for those of you who venture over toward Port Townsend. There is a somewhat similar barn to the Willowwood barn that is at the intersection of Center Road and Highway 20. So just kind of south of Chimicum. It's similar in the sense that, sort of the core is an old gable barn with these hip roofed extensions all the way around it. So just, another example of kind of a, massive early kind of 19th century barn that had been adapted for many uses over many decades. Anybody have a favorite barn they want to talk about in there as you all go through the preserve and sort of say hello to the barns you go past? Anybody have a favorite?
I like them all. They're it's like, trying to say which child is your favorite. They're all the best. And can I just add a little bit of context to my last statement about the Smith Farm, that at the moment, their farming activities are pretty limited. So since they don't really have an agricultural need for a large barn, they are holding off on that. You know, obviously they would love to have a barn that they can use, but they just don't have the need for that right now. There is some limited farming going on there now, but it's pretty limited in scope. So.
As a relative newcomer to the area, I noticed that you said that there could only be one building on that site. Is that a rule for the reserve, or how is that determined?
So the National Park Service scenic easements, of which there's a few dozen within the reserve, each easement was written at a certain time to, you know, fill certain need for both the property owner and at the time and the needs of the scenic easement. So there's they all vary widely in what kind of restrictions there are. That one in particular, as you know, is right in the middle of Ebey's Prairie, so is a very visible farm cluster. So that's what the scenic easement paperwork terms say.
Great. Well, Holly, we are so thankful for your presentation and all this good information. I will probably put together a little sheet describing that tour that you talked about, and maybe verify some details for you, so that way we can have that as a resource out at the Ebey House this summer, and maybe develop some sort of handout. We'll see how that goes. But thank you so much for your help with just putting all of this into perspective. There are, like you said, 22, 23 registered barns. So I feel like that is a lot to take in, especially in 30, 40 minutes. So thanks for just giving us a brief overview and breaking that down as well. I've really appreciated that. If you guys have any questions for Holly, later, if something comes up, or as you're talking about it, things come up, feel free to email me. I can get them over to Holly, and hopefully just answer all of our questions and really go into the summer with one more sort of tool on our belt. You know, Heritage Barns, you all know it perfectly now, so we're good to go. And thank you so much, Holly. We appreciate it. If you guys have any questions, again, email me. You'll be hearing from me for the Zoom link for next week on Friday. So thank you again, Holly. And I will see you guys next Tuesday.
Great. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Thank you.